Okay, welcome everyone to BCCIC's webinar on Canada and the SDGs. We'll be talking a little bit about our new report that we just released, Where Canada Stands, Volume 3. We'll be talking about some policy briefs that we've done in cooperation with the Canadian Council for International Cooperation. And we'll be talking a little bit with Economic and Social Development Canada about the new Sustainable Development Goals implementation strategy. So we've got a lot on the agenda, and we'll pretty much just get right into it. We'll just take a moment to note that this is a pretty exciting time for Canada and the SDGs. We've got the high-level political forum in the United Nations coming up in a week, actually. So it's great timing to have all of these new things coming out for the support of making progress on Agenda 2030 in Canada. So without further ado, I'll actually hand it over to Nicholas Moyer from the Canadian Council for International Cooperation, who'll be talking a little bit about some policy briefs on the Sustainable Development Goals that we did in partnership. So take it away, Nicholas.
Well, thank you, and hi everyone. So yes, my name is Nick. I'm with the Canadian Council for International Cooperation. We're the National Association representing the international development and humanitarian organizations in Canada. And for those who don't know, that's over 2,000 organizations that work in this space, that employ 14,000 Canadians, that spend $5 billion a year trying to help make the world a better place. We're based in Ottawa, so it's a pleasure to be joining you. And really just to give a brief introduction to this project that we have done jointly, and of which many of the outputs you can actually consult already online. It's been a pleasure to work with BCCIC on this, and building on work that CCIC has done in recent years, particularly looking at voluntary national reviews conducted globally. And we've done annual reports called Implementing National SDGs. And that VNR report is one that we have launched early in each of the last 3 years. And it's really building on that experience, looking at what is global best practice, that we felt it was important as the Canadian government was looking at its national implementation strategy, that we work to try to glean some of that best practice globally and bring that here for how it was relevant in Canada. And so we did this project jointly with BCCIC, looking specifically at the development of 10 briefs, which Laurel worked on closely with Shannon Kindernay on our team, our Director of Research, Policy and Practice, who by all rights should be here in my place, because she did certainly the work on this from CCIC's side. This was a project that we felt was important because of so much experience globally that is relevant to us here. It was also something we did jointly with respect to a couple of other initiatives. We particularly wanted to also be expanding our relationships in Canada and raise the profile of the SDGs and SDG implementation here. And so the briefs have been one way for us to do that, and we'll get to those in a moment. But also I want to signal that it was a real great opportunity for us to work with, particularly building on our relationship with the Canadian Association for the Study of International Development, CASID, and our joint project called the Next Generation of Research, so to speak, which has looked at creating a database of researchers in Canada looking at international humanitarian and development work. But this project allowed us to expand that lens. And so we now have been able to find over 600 researchers that work in this space that are now going to be searchable through our database. And for those of you who may not know of it, you can find it at nextgendatabase.ca. It will be updated very soon with new information there for you to consult. And all this really in the intention of expanding collaboration and engagement. Now, the 10 policy briefs, 8 of them are up, both on BCCIC's website and on CCIC's website, and 2 more are to come. They're available in French and English, some amazing content there. But given Laurel's own work on this, I think I will simply be handing over to her to run through this.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. So hello, everyone. My name is Laurel Wayne-Nixon. I'm the SDG policy researcher at BCCIC. And as Nick mentioned, BCCIC and CCCIC wrote a series of policy briefs on Agenda 2030 implementation in Canada and globally. I'll mostly be focusing on the Canadian series, which looks at good practice for 2030 agenda implementation and focuses on the Canadian context. So this series included briefs on multi-stakeholder engagement, raising awareness, partnerships, policy and data gap assessment, localization, coordination, accountability, policy coherence, capacity development, and reporting. So as you can tell, there's a lot of briefs and a lot of topics that we touched on. And these briefs were written by assessing good practices in Agenda 2030 implementation from countries around the world. We assessed these good practices laid out in voluntary national reviews and then interviewed civil society actors and sometimes government actors in these countries and used this to make suggestions about what implementation could look like in the Canadian context. Although I don't have time to go through all of the key messages of every single brief in each topic, I'll sum up a few key points that we found through our entire research. So the first is, throughout all of the brief topics, it was clear that each component of implementation affects who gets left behind. This means that whether it's multi-stakeholder engagement or policy gaps, leave no one behind must be embraced. To not leave anyone behind means ensuring that no one is left behind at every stage and component of implementation. The second main finding was that the federal government cannot achieve Agenda 2030 alone. Effective 2030 agenda implementation in Canada means partnership and participation from many levels of government, different organizations, and different people in society. To achieve a whole of society implementation approach means engagement and partnership at every single stage of implementation. The third finding is that all stages of implementation should be planned and a roadmap should be created. It is important to consider each step of implementation when planning how Canada should achieve Agenda 2030. For example, when considering multi-stakeholder engagement, it is also important to consider partnerships, awareness, and capacity development. What happens at one stage of the process affects the success of the entire process, but also affects the steps of one stage of the process. There are many other findings from these briefs, which you can find on our website and CCIC's, as Nick mentioned. And if you're interested, I encourage you to visit one of these websites to read the entire series. There's lots of good information there. And I'll just quickly touch on these briefs in relation to the recent release of the interim document of the national strategy. So this has had meaningful components that we really wanted to see that was very reflective of the recommendations that we made in our policy briefs. And one thing that stuck out to me kind of as my first notion of things that I wish that I could have seen was speaking about intergenerational equity and also speaking about planetary boundaries, as these are key principles and tenets underlying the 2030 agenda. So I'm hoping to see this in the final document. And also Shannon and I wrote an article about everything that we hope to see in the strategy. And this included guidance on all aspects of 2030 agenda implementation. It also included a plan to leave no one behind, a national plan for global leadership, and a robust accountability system. I definitely see all aspects of these components within the strategies, but there's lacking specific details. For example, there's guidance on 2030 agenda implementation, but we're hoping for a more in-depth roadmap that lays out implementation. And we hope for more technical information about how Agenda 2030 will be achieved. This isn't to say that it won't come yet, since this is an interim document, but it is something that we hope to see in the final strategy. And throughout all of the other components that we hope to see, there are definitely notions of all of these components, which is really promising and exciting. So I'll pass this back on to Diane or Deb, and thank you, everyone.
Great, thank you, Laurel, and thank you very much to Nicholas as well for being able to join us. I know you have another meeting you need to get to today, so unfortunately you won't be able to join us for the question period, but I'm sure if anyone has any questions specifically for Nicholas, you can reach out to CCIC, and I'm sure he'd be more than happy to engage you about the policy briefs or anything else. So I see a quick note from one of the attendees to please not speak too quickly, as we have some people on the call who do not speak English as their first language. So if everyone could try to slow it down just a little bit, that would be very helpful to make the information accessible to everyone on the webinar. So I'm going to hand it over to Deborah Glazer, who headed our Where Canada Stands report this year, and actually every year for the last few years. This report was just released on Friday, and it goes over the Sustainable Development Goals that are under review this year. And so, Deb, I'll let you pretty much just explain it and introduce your team. So thanks very much in advance.
Thanks. And can we get our slides up, please?
Yes, let me do that.
And I think I saw another chat come up about trying to take notes. I believe this is being recorded, and so that you will be able to reference it in the future. Thank you, Diane. So I will try to speak slowly. We're on a pretty condensed timeline because we want to leave as much time available for Q&A. And if you can go ahead and advance to the next slide, I'll just skip over who I am. So as Diane said, on Friday we released Where Canada Stands Volume 3. This is the 5th in the BCCIC series of Canada-focused SDG reports. In 2015, with the adoption of the 2030 Agenda, BCCIC released Keeping Score, which explored Canada's role in developing and achieving the SDGs. And then the following year, released Keeping Track, which looked at how Canada might develop targets and indicators to measure progress towards achieving the SDGs. And then in 2017 and last year, BCCIC started developing Spotlight or shadow reports. And we believed it was important to have an annual assessment of Canadian progress, even in the absence of an official voluntary national review. Of course, last year there was a Canadian VNR, and so it was a shadow report from a civil society perspective. So this year, the Volume 3 of Where Canada Stands evaluates Canada's progress towards the final set of goals under review at HLPF 2019. So that's SDGs 4, 8, 10, 13, 16, and 17, which is reviewed every year, but we explore a different aspect of it in each report. And our authors, our great team of researchers who will be introduced on their own slides, will be able to go into more depth on each of those goals. But I want to say why it's a little bit important. It's important every year, but particularly this year with this report and with HLPF in general, is that with this HLPF, all of the goals will have been reviewed once. Also, there will be an SDG Summit alongside the UN General Assembly in September, and this is going to be the first overall comprehensive review of progress on the SDGs and a chance to identify areas for action to accelerate progress globally and, of course, for Canada. So please advance to the next slide. So because of those key meetings that are going on this year, HLPF and the SDG Summit, we made an effort to link performance on the 6 goals under review this year to a broader picture of how Canada is achieving the 2030 Agenda overall up to this point. And as Laurel pointed out, the guiding principle of Agenda 2030 is leave no one behind. So the guiding question for our report this year, and in fact, all the reports that we've produced, is who is being left behind? And to answer that question, we need to do more than look at national data, which gives a single snapshot of where Canada is. We believe that we have to look deeper to get a sense of how we're doing on the goals across a diverse cross-section of geographies and demographics. So what we did was first look at that national snapshot. Okay, what does data from StatsCan say? That gives us our basic snapshot. But we wanted a more quantitative and qualitative analysis of how Canada is doing with both gaps and successes and how we might improve. So we analyzed both subnational data where available, and we interviewed experts to provide a more nuanced and refined picture of how Canada is doing with regard to demographic and geographic diversity. Some of those experts are on the call today, so they'll be able to answer some questions and contribute to the conversation later during the Q&A session. And we also made an effort, and we've done so for every report thus far, to include at least one expert from an Indigenous community in our review team for our experts for each goal. And we felt that was important because it became clear from the very first report that a major group that is being left behind is Indigenous communities. And so there is a different way of assessing sustainability, different definitions for sustainability and assessing progress that we need to consider when we're talking about a Canadian approach to SDG implementation. So once we interviewed the experts, we were able to come up with a series of recommendations, and those are at the conclusion of each chapter to accelerate Canadian progress on the SDGs. Every chapter also includes a regional case study that we believe gives a more nuanced picture of how the SDGs are being achieved across Canada at a subnational level. And we also have a series of cross-cutting themes that we identified a couple of years ago with the first report. And these are themes that we believe that were important, that touch upon all the goals and may not be explicitly called out in the targets and indicators that make up the SDGs. I think that's time for me. And that is the conclusion. So that's kind of the methodology we used. And now I'm going to hand it over to the team to go over in more depth each of the goals that they were in charge of reviewing. So I'll hand it off to Jeffrey Chi, who's BCCIC's Policy Analyst and Coordinator for Climate Change, to review SDG 4.
Right. Hi, everyone. My name is Jeffrey. As Deb has said, I'm the BCCIC Policy Analyst and Coordinator for Climate Change. However, first I will start by talking about quality education, Goal 4. So as I said, Canada continues to lead the world in providing equitable access of education to all, from early childhood education all the way to continuing education. In Canada right now, there are 15,000 elementary and secondary schools with over 315,000 educators in the public education sector, providing free and quality K-12 education to over 5 million school-age children and youth. And Canada continues to lead the world in providing equitable access by empowering women and people of all gender and race in the public education sector. Right now, 67% of female and 63% of male in Canada has completed post-secondary education in Canada, and 91% of the population aged 25 to 64 have completed secondary education. And in Canada, we have one of the best public education system, a K-12 public education system in the world, as shown time to time again in the Program for International Student Assessments, the PISA assessments conducted by the OECD every single 4 years. In last year, all students from Canadian provinces have received a score above the OECD average. With notably British Columbian students received a score of 561, ranking the first in the world and tied with Singapore. And this is something we need to celebrate, that the Canadian education system is continuously producing high quality and equitable access to all students. However, there are a few key groups that are left behind in our pursuit of achieving a better public education system. Mainly, they are the indigenous peoples, rural and remote communities, families living in poverty, and they need better support from the governments, both federal and provincial, to kind of enhance their educational access. So I talked to 3 different organizations about pre-K education, K-12 education, as well as university or tertiary education. For pre-K education, the key for Canada right now is to having accessibility, affordability, and the quality of the curriculum. Right now, there is a huge differences in terms of accessibility to pre-K education across the country. In Quebec, it's $183 per month for pre-K education. However, this price is very different from province to province. For example, in Toronto, it costs almost as much as $1,354 per month just to send your kids to the pre-K or daycare. And that is a real burden for many Canadians to balance their work life and balance their responsibility towards child caring. And also the early childhood educators are some of the most undervalued workers in Canada, earning 40% less than any other Canadian female with similar education attainment levels working full-time in other sectors. And early childhood education is pretty much non-existent on Indigenous reserves, and that's something the federal government needs to look more into when they deal with education on reserves, which is a federal responsibility. In terms of K-12 education, as I said, Canada has one of the best K-12 education system in the world. However, there is a real challenge in providing these services to rural and northern communities. I look at a case in the Northwest Territories. It's called the Inuktitut School. It is the only K-9 school in the community of Sachs Harbor. And kids when they complete grade 9, they have to relocate to a different community thousands of kilometers away just to finish their secondary education. And that is a mental strain for a lot of them to move to a new community, to get new friends and all that. So there is a real challenge. As well as, also in terms of the tertiary education, Canada failed its first generation students. These are students whose parents have not gone to university, so they're the first generation in their family to go on into tertiary education. Most of the times they do not have the resources, both financial and any other resources to help them to go through the tertiary education. And also Indigenous educational attainment in tertiary education sector is improving over the years. However, is consistently 30% lower than the average Canadian level. So it is a real challenge in Canada in terms of education policies, because education is divided. It's a mainly provincial responsibility with some federal responsibility towards tertiary education, as well as to education to Indigenous communities. So in my recommendation, we really need to have a pan-Canadian approach towards setting a national priority and a set of standards on quality education, while taking into local circumstances and cultural diversity into consideration. We also need to set up supports to Indigenous students through an Indigenous-led education support framework. And these sustained financial transfers from the federal governments to different Indigenous governance organization and Indigenous-led civil society organization in support of their curriculum modernizing plan and transitional and continuing education efforts. Provincial government should also increase availability and subsidies for early childhood education and expand incentives for pre-K educators to work in remote and rural communities. Overall, Canada is on track in meeting the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of quality education. However, there are lots of different subgroups that are being left behind, and they need more support from the government in achieving those goals and leaving no one behind. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jeffrey. I think Sadie is next, Sadie DeCoste, talking about SDG 8.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're a little quiet. I don't know if you can get closer to the mic, but we can hear you.
Yeah, is this a little better?
Little bit. Yeah, get right close to the computer.
Okay. Hope you enjoy this close-up of my face. So for this report, I was working on SDG 8, which is about economic growth and decent work. So overall in Canada, we see slow economic growth lately, slower than it has been in the past, but we still maintain overall a relatively high standard of well-being. And our employment rates are similar to other countries in the OECD, but we still have room to tighten the labor market and improve labor conditions for Canadian workers. So in terms of this aspect of good work, this concept, the principle of decency, which refers to essentially not only having a job and having a job that pays you fairly, but a job that makes you feel like you have ownership in your work life, like you are able to have a life outside of work, that you feel that you have a say and you have rights as an employee. This concept of decency that's defined by the International Labour Organization has not been formally adopted in Canada in terms of a recognition in the government. And we still do see that the economy is based largely on low-wage labor, largely in the service sector, as well as the export of relatively unrefined natural resources. And so, especially in terms of low-wage work, we have employment and decent work gaps for women who are still paid less than men, Indigenous people, migrant workers, and people with disabilities. And this is partially due to overt discrimination and also due to systemic barriers to accessing work. And there's a particular issue that our interviewees highlighted with the Temporary Foreign Workers Program, in which workers are brought over from other countries, and they can be vulnerable to exploitation from their employers. Also in Canada, we have to deal with the transition away from fossil fuels and what that means for ensuring that workers in the natural resource sectors are able to transition in a fair way to work in the clean energy economy. I think there's another slide here. Right. So some of the things identified moving forward for the economy and for fair work is getting exports from small and medium enterprises to global markets, ensuring that they are also see formal commitment by the government to creating jobs. And by doing so, also investing in clean technology, renewable energy, and machinery. Further, we'd like to see them commit to the principle of decent work, as I discussed a little bit earlier, and to conduct a full review of the employment insurance program, because we see that not everyone who wishes to use this program has access to it. Finally, on the Temporary Foreign Workers Program, we would hope to see the low-wage stream of that program wind down and offer pathways to permanent residency for workers who come from other countries. And also a commitment to creating employment opportunities and wraparound support systems for Indigenous people living on reserve and off, and taking into account the recommendations from the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, and also the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And that's it for SDG 8. I'm going to pass it off to Kayla, who will be talking about inequality.
Hi, you able to hear me okay? And yeah, okay, awesome. Yeah, so I authored the chapter on Goal 10, Reduced Inequalities, which aims to reduce inequalities within and between countries. And in our report, we stress that the essence of Goal 10 really is equity, which means treating individuals justly based on their circumstances. So social stratifications such as Indigenous status, race, and sexual orientation, age, gender, all of these can result in unfair costs and barriers to a decent quality of life. And all of these at-risk populations in Canada do face barriers. And so Goal 10 is unique in that it explicitly focuses on who is getting left behind. But it also makes it a bit of a wicked problem and a very difficult goal to review extensively. So I'm only going to briefly summarize some of our main findings, and I highly recommend looking at the report for a more in-depth summary. It's worth noting that a lot of Canadian experts on social equity think that the 2030 deadline is too far in the future for Canada to implement or to reduce things like wealth inequality and discrimination in Canada. Like we have the resources and are able to act really fast on things like reducing wealth inequality and improving the quality of life for Indigenous Canadians and such. So next slide, please. So the targets under Goal 10 can be divided into 3 major themes. And the first is wealth inequality, which is a distinct issue from poverty because it is more systemic. It really is where poverty focuses on sort of unintended consequences of the way that an economy is run. Inequality is systemic. So one of the recommended indicators for wealth inequality on the UN-hosted SDG website is the rate of income growth of the bottom 40%, but this focuses more on poverty, and really what we should be doing is focusing on the redistributive power of taxation and social programs in Canada. And our experts have noted that that governments in Canada of all levels have not done anything to explicitly reduce the distribution of, or reduce wealth inequality. It's always been focused on reducing poverty. And so one of the recommendations for a more nuanced Canada-specific indicator on wealth inequality was, as opposed to this bottom 40% income growth rate, that like the benefits received through public spending per capita is a better indicator of how well we are redistributing wealth in the country. Next slide. So the second main topic area was discrimination in Canadian organizations. And as far as this topic area goes, it's Canadian organizations and employers, such as businesses, governments, nonprofit organizations. It is them that are the gatekeepers of inclusivity and overall equality of opportunity within society. And so a lot of our interviewees noted that taste discrimination is quite persistent in Canadian organizations still. So especially racialized individuals or those with disabilities, they face systemic barriers to getting positions in workplaces. And sometimes this is due to implicit bias. And so really pouring resources into bias training is one thing that is quite needed in a lot of organizations. And also foreign workers often will come to Canada, and they're highly skilled, but their credentials are not recognized, and so they will often take work that they're underqualified for, and this also sort of contributes to wealth inequality because a lot of them are taking minimum wage jobs. Next slide. And so the final topic area focused more on just migration policies and basically the proportion of remittances the opportunity cost of remittances sent from migrant workers in Canada to where they came from. So migrants will often send monies back to their families or friends in the countries that they came from. And our report found that the majority of remittances, so the proportion of the total dollar amount actually goes to high income countries and not so much low income countries. And also the cost, so the goal remittance cost, which is basically just either the taxes or the bank fees paid on these amounts sent back home, are approximately 6% right now, and the goal is 3%. So we're getting there. And one of the reasons for this is simply that the mode in which individuals choose to transfer their money really influences the remittance costs. So sending money through a direct bank transfer can cost them more than just bringing cash home. And so education programs for migrants that sort of tell them their best options for reducing remittance costs is also something that should be looked into.
Sorry, Kayla, just a couple seconds to wrap up.
Okay, yeah. So I'll just wrap up here. So yeah, we have several recommendations, both for nuanced Canada-specific indicators as well as policies that the government should look into that are outlined in our report for Goal 10. And I'll pass it on to Sadie to introduce Goal 13.
Hi. So Jeffrey, Kayla, and I worked jointly on this chapter 13, which is about climate action. So some findings that we have are that Canada is actually warming faster than the global average at twice the rate, especially up in the north, and that we are feeling the effects of climate change now in heat waves, flooding, forest fires, and yet we're not necessarily showing global leadership on our action in terms of stopping climate change and doing our fair share to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So we see, for example, that Canada's target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 30% above 2005 levels by 2030 is not in line with the 1.5 degree Celsius increase target that we're trying to get to in the world. And yet it's also not quite on track to meet that target. Actually, next slide, I'm talking about mitigation here. So we hope to see Canada increasing its ambition on climate mitigation in reducing its, increasing the targets for its emissions reductions. And we hope to see that in the next year. That being said, Canada does have one of the most comprehensive suite of policies that it's ever had for confronting climate change, and that's the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, which does include the carbon taxation, other big measures like investments in transportation and energy and clean fuel standards, and yet unfortunately Canada hasn't reduced its dependency on fossil fuels, which is the largest part of Canada's progress must be from its energy transition away from the oil and gas sector. Moving on to adaptation.
So I'll be discussing adaptation. So adaptation refers to our preparedness to minimize harm and maintain quality of life in the face of climate effects. And adaptation is mentioned in the Pan-Canadian Framework, but the specifics aren't extensively outlined, so it hasn't really been discussed much at the federal level in Canada until recently. In late 2018, Environment and Climate Change Canada convened an expert panel on adaptation and resilience. And so a bunch of experts from academia and civil society and government came together and outlined both indicators, specific indicators for tracking how well we're adapting to climate change and just identifying main areas to focus on. And so it touches on very specific topics such as enhanced surveillance of food, water, and vector-borne disease proliferation, training healthcare providers to identify and respond to climate-related physical and mental health risks, and just increasing general awareness in the population of slow onset events like melting permafrost and rising sea levels, and the mapping of climate hazards, and notably improving the integration of Indigenous traditional knowledge systems into adaptation planning. So we're excited to see the discussion on adaptation move forward in the near future. Next slide. And the third main subject area under climate action is finance, which is just mobilizing the necessary resources to adapt to climate change, both home and abroad. And so in 2015, Canada had pledged $2.65 billion over 5 years, so it'll end in 2021, in support of the Paris Climate Agreement. And in the opinion of civil society, this is far less than Canada's fair share of the committed climate finance under the Paris Agreement, which is $100 billion US per year from developed countries by 2021 annually. And so what Canada has pledged thus far only amounts to about 500 million per year, which is approximately equivalent to Canada's percentage of total global wealth. And so that's, in that sense, it's fair, but we need to realize that there are countries that are refusing to pay their fair share. And so there really is a need and an opportunity for leadership to pledge more than is required. And several countries such as Norway and Germany have done this. And so there really is no reason why Canada cannot. One positive outcome of climate finance is that it has been integrated a little bit more in Canada's official development assistance. And so there are many grants that have been explicitly being sent to low and middle income countries to assist with climate resilience, infrastructure, and education programs and such. And so that's a nice thing to see. And I'll hand it over to Jeffrey briefly to summarize moving forward.
Great. Moving forward on Canadian climate action, now we have the Pan-Canadian Framework on climate change and climate action and clean growth. We need to walk the talk. So we need a robust accountability framework to track the progress we made under the Pan-Canadian Framework. And we need a multi-year review cycle to increase the ambition on targets, but to make sure that these targets are more and more ambitious over the years. And we also need to take a strong action to completely phase out fossil fuel subsidies and discourage the growth of the fossil fuel sector in Canada. If Canada is going to truly be the climate leader it claims itself to be, we need to take a firm stance against new projects that involve the export of petroleum products. However, when we talk about phasing out fossil fuel, we also need to be aware of the job sector and the social circumstances of Alberta, and we need to following through the commitments to a just transition for workers in the oil and gas sectors to transition into a clean economy jobs through job training and employment insurance. We also need to harness the potential for vegetative ecosystem on land, such as forests and wetlands, as well as blue carbon systems to act as carbon storage. And if these carbon storage sinks are destroyed, we need them to be reflected in our greenhouse gas inventory. And their restoration is a potential for gaining carbon credits in a cap and trade system. And these forests and wetlands, as well as blue carbon systems, is also a potential for natural-based solutions in adapting to climate impacts in different regions of Canada. Lastly, we need to implement a detailed plan and timeline for adaptation-related initiatives, including enhancing climate-related health risk capacity, their research and their natural disaster preparedness, investing in climate resilience infrastructure, and protecting economies that are sensitive to climate impacts, such as fisheries, logging, and other sectors, especially natural resource sector. I'll give the floor to Nora Sahachu on SDG 16.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Hi, everyone. My chapter is on peace, justice, and strong institutions, and the process that came up to finalization of this chapter was really amazing. I've met with so many amazing experts throughout Canada. I interviewed people from east to west, and even as north as Edmonton, Alberta. I captured Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC, Ontario, Quebec, and I think this is about it, Canada-wide. And the opinions were so diverse among these experts, particularly in terms of access to justice, in terms of incarceration, in terms of violence against women, immigrants, and Indigenous people, and particularly on human rights and overall addressing access to justice issues. In terms of where we are, particularly I focused on the number of victims of international homicide in Canada, which has moved from 1.68 per 100,000 population in 2016 to 1.8 per 100,000 people or population in 2017. This is not a big movement in terms of the numbers, but it does, even if the number shows increase here, it actually, according to the overall population increase, which is 1 million people have increased between 2016 and 2019, this number marks a drop on homicide rates. In terms of proportion of young women and men aged between 18 and 29 years who have experienced sexual violence by the age of 18, this number was measured in 2014. At that time, it was 8%. And if we look at the global average today, it is the same number of the global average, which for Canada doesn't really bode very well, very positive. Some reports produced by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network and Brookings Institute have estimated that this number will reach 38.3% in 2030. And this is one of the worrying indicators for Canada. This is one of the backtracking numbers that are shown for Canada. Within overall numbers, Indigenous women are particularly vulnerable and left beside, because statistically they are at least 12 times more likely to experience violence, and at least 6 times have greater homicide rates compared to other non-Indigenous women. The same worrying numbers are in terms of Indigenous men, whose numbers are increasingly high. They contain 25% of the overall detainees population, whereas we know that population of Indigenous people in Canada is only 4.9%.
Sorry, Nora, just one more minute to wrap up.
Okay. Unsentenced detainees as a proportion of overall prison population numbers has moved from 35% in 2014-2015 to 37.7% in 2015-16. This also marks an increase, and it is forecasted that it can reach up to 41% by 2030. And the last indicator that is measured is on Canadian Human Rights Commission, which is in full compliance with Paris principles, and it maintains category A status. The discussion is more on how to use this Canadian experience to promote with the other countries which are lagging behind on this indicator. If you can switch to the other slide, please.
Okay.
When we think about moving on global goals, we know that SDG unit was established to advance integration, mainstreaming, and policy support for SDGs. There is a strategy for Canada's National Development 2030 Agenda, which is designed in an inclusive and participatory way. National Center for Truth and Reconciliation is established, and the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women was just recently launched, marking a breakthrough this year. It was just launched on June 3rd. There is a national crime prevention strategy for Canada for implementation of community-based crime prevention and early identification of risks and response mechanisms, the victim surcharge provision programs, and of course, lots of Canadian leadership in moving global multilateral treaty negotiations such as Paris Agreement and Women, Peace and Security. In terms of recommendations, there should be a support to provincial, territorial, and community-based initiatives to deal more effectively with guns and gangs, which is one of the worrying numbers that the indicators show, and support to Canadian Centre for Child Protection can combat online exploitation of children as the most vulnerable group in Canada's society, and another worrying numbers on the rise. And of course, the upcoming membership negotiations that Canada is doing recently with the UN Security Council for 2021 leadership is one of the opportunities to promote partnership with civil society, women, peace and security, but also in promoting Canada's experience and leadership for peace mediation around the world. Thank you so much, and over to Kila for Goal 17.
Hey, thank you, Nora. So Goal 17 gets reviewed at the high-level political forum every year, and BCCIC focuses on a different sub-area under Goal 17. So this year we focused on the trade-related targets, which aim to foster equitable trade practice around the world as a vehicle for sustainable development. And the interesting thing with these targets is that they're super broadly framed. So one of them, for instance, is very simply the worldwide weighted tariff average is an indicator of how equitable and open trade is. And that's not a very good quantitative indicator because, for instance, as one of the experts put it, China and a hypothetical free trade agreement between China and the United States could drastically lower the worldwide weighted tariff average, but have nothing to do with sustainable development. And so it really is up to Canada in implementing its own sustainable development strategy to come up with this more nuanced indicators that are specific to our experiences here. Next slide, please. So the Canadian International Development Platform is one of the foremost organizations on this topic in Canada, trade and development. And some of their work has shown that if we look at the numbers, trade flows between Canada and low to middle income countries are not equitable. For trade flows with countries such as Vietnam and Sri Lanka and the Philippines, the dollar amount of tariffs paid on these trade flows by these low and middle income countries far exceed their fair share of trade with Canada. So for example, India accounts for 0.6% of imports into Canada, but they pay about 2.5% of the total tariffs collected by Canada. And the explanation for this is very straightforward. It's simply that the majority of Canada's trade flows are with Mexico and the US, and this trade is tariff-free. But it's an inequitable arrangement. And so if Canada is serious about trade equity and making trade more accessible to developing countries, then it should look at these numbers. And it's also worth noting that in a lot of cases, the tariffs paid by these low and middle income countries also exceed the dollar amount of official development assistance that they receive from Canada, which is a little bit backwards. in my opinion and the opinion of many. Next slide. So I touched on on trade between U.S. and Canada. Previous one. And I just wanted to note that the new Canada, U.S., Mexico Free Trade Agreement actually has an entire article explicitly acknowledging the importance of sustainable development, which is interesting to see, and well, not sure how it'll manifest itself at all, but it's good to see that it's actually being acknowledged. And there may be some development implications for specific groups in Canada, for instance, Canadian dairy farmers, and decent economic growth as a result of the new policies in CUSMA, but it's a little too early to know. There's no data yet. Sorry, next slide. So foreign direct investment and official development assistance are two ways that we can make low and middle income countries more competitive trade partners. We can't, because trade is done by for the most part, large corporations in Canada, there's little that the government can actually do to increase trade flows with developing countries. But like we can incentivize it, but really firms will just go with where they want to do business with. And so using these other mechanisms, these other funding mechanisms to inject infrastructure and expertise in developing countries will empower them so that they'll become more desirable trade partners with Canadian firms. And the case study for this chapter on Goal 17 gives an example of that, a really wonderful example. So moving forward on Goal 17, so I had mentioned earlier, just looking at the numbers, comparing the proportion of tariffs paid by low and middle income countries compared with either their share of total trade or the ODA receives, is a great Canada-specific indicator for gauging trade for development. And also there are educational initiatives run by Global Affairs Canada called trade missions that make firms aware of trade opportunities, but thus far these have only been in high income countries, and so GAC can show leadership by implementing these trade missions, but with trade partners in low and middle income countries. And then we also have a few indicator recommendations for Goal 17 as well that are a little bit more specific than those recommended on the UN hosted website. And that is all from me, and that is also all from the report.
Great, thanks, Kayla. Sorry, just give me a moment to get us back here. Okay, so thank you very much for the Where Canada Stands report team. That was comprehensive for sure. If anyone's interested in more of the details, that report is available on BCCIC's website. You can just go to bccic.ca and there should be somewhere to click where you can find it right from the front page. I'm going to hand it over right now to Tina Cobb, who is from Economic and Social Development Canada and also is on the Sustainable Development Goals unit, if I'm not mistaken. So Tina, I'll just allow you to introduce yourself and speak a little bit about the SDG implementation strategy for Canada.
For sure, thank you very much. So yes, my name is Tina Cobb. I work at the newly minted Sustainable Development Goals unit at ESDC. I'm a senior policy advisor working on partnerships and engagement as well as the SDG funding program. So first, I just want to commend BCCIC and CCIC on the excellent work on both the policy briefs on where Canada stands on SDGs under review at the upcoming HLPF, as well as all of the, sorry. Hi, sorry, I've got a crew of people outside of my desk. Sorry, yes, I wanted to say thank you for all the great work and also for all of the feedback that we received as we were developing towards Canada's 2030 Agenda National Strategy. As you know, we released this document on June 28th, so last Friday. And it is really a result of all of the nationwide consultations that we've been doing since the SDG unit was created last October. It is an interim document that we hope to continue to consult on over the course of the summer as we further refine it with the hopes of releasing a strategy in the winter of 2020. So it really is a first step at establishing the structures and processes and activities needed to be put into place to move the 2030 agenda forward. Highlights partnerships, innovation, and the investment required to achieve the SDGs. It includes 30 concrete federal actions, and it's really and it lays out the foundation for the development of the Canadian indicator framework. And that is really the first draft of the Canadian indicator framework. It has some proposed ambitions and indicators and targets in there, and this is the foundation to accurately track and report on our progress, as well as, with the hope of developing it to a point where we can look beyond the GDP to measure growth, sustainability, and well-being in a more holistic way. This current iteration of the Canadian Indicator Framework is a result of a review of federal policies, strategies, and initiatives related to all of the SDGs, and it was done in consultation with all other government departments and agencies involved. Also and I'm probably speaking too fast, sorry. Also on June 28th, we were pleased to launch the next wave of our SDG funding program, which is a call for proposals for contributions up to $300,000 and multi-year up to 3 years in duration, with the objectives to support innovation, knowledge sharing, and addressing the data and research gaps in Canada. This complements the continuous intake process that we have right now, that we launched on May 7th for grants up to $100,000, where the objectives of that program are really about increasing awareness of the 2030 agenda, stakeholder engagement, building partnerships, etc. So we had a big day last Friday, and we're really excited to have something out in the window now. And certainly it was all the policy briefs and all of the feedback from the councils across Canada, frankly, was really helpful to us, and we take that feedback seriously. So thank you very much for all that hard work.
Great.
And that's about it.
Great, thank you, Tina. So I suppose we'll go into a question and answer section. So for anyone who's attending, you can see some of the buttons on the bottom here. There's one that says Q&A. If you want to submit a question, you can submit it through there. Also, or if the chat is easier, there's a little chat button. You can put your question in the chat. So we'd be happy to take your questions to any of the speakers that have spoken so far, except for Nicholas, of course, he's had to go to another meeting. But any of the report writers can take a question, and Tina would be happy to take a question, I'm sure. So if anyone has any questions, we can take those. I saw one question from earlier in the chat, so maybe I'll put this out to, I'm not sure who this would be best addressed to, but they were wondering if the SDGs are reflective of the idea of a circular economy. So maybe that would be a question for Sadie or for Tina.
Yeah, this isn't something that I kind of was looking at when I was doing the chapter on good work and economic growth. And I think partially that is just because of the indicators that goal looks at specifically. But there is an SDG which I am less familiar with. If a person is really up on their SDG trivia, they might be able to tell me which goal it is that talks about renewable resources or resource use. Anyone?
There's both. So there's SDG 7, which is renewable and affordable energy, but there's SDG 12, which is all about sustainable consumption and production. And I think that's what you're thinking of. And that was covered in our report last year.
Do you have any memory of that concept of a circular economy being used in that?
I do recall that we talked about it last year. At this point, I'm so steeped in this year's report, just completing it, that it's not at the front of my mind, but I would encourage you to visit the BCCIC website, and that report is there as well on the website. You can look at the review of SDG 12.
Great. Anyone else comments on circular economy?
Sure, it's Tina. I just wanted to flag that Canada is hosting the 2020 World Circular Economy Forum. The Minister of Environment and Climate Change announced this in earlier this month. Yeah, so not a ton of information out about it yet, but we will be bringing together business and thought leaders from around the world to talk about the circular economy.
Great, that's really interesting. I'll have to follow up on that and promote it through BCCIC. Yeah. Anyone else? Circular economy? No, hearing none. There was another question about, we'll just make this public, about the summit in September. So we haven't talked very much about the SDG Summit. The question is, what is the biggest need to increase sustainability practices of companies in Canada? I don't know if that's in relation to the summit or if that's a separate question, but maybe on that timeline. Does anyone have a response to either of those? Maybe about the summit first. Anyone have more insight on the SDG Summit, which is happening alongside the General Assembly? Deb, were you speaking?
Oh, I was just saying, sorry, I was trying to look up last year's report as you were speaking. So sorry, that for the SDG Summit, what's going on? So my understanding, and I think everyone who will be attending HLPF next week will find out more, is that it's a chance not just to look at, all right, we've had 4 years to, or 3 years, I guess, to look at all the goals under review. So we can both do an overall assessment of how we're doing on the goals, but also an assessment and a comprehensive review of Agenda 2030 in general. Are we using the right reporting mechanisms? Is it structured the right way? So it's kind of my understanding is that that's how the summit's going to work. But I think in terms of details, what I've seen so far is a relatively kind of high-level agenda, and probably what typically happens is that you don't get more detail until closer to the actual meeting. But hopefully next week, over the next 2 weeks at HLPF, more details will come forward. And maybe Tina, you know more about this.
Yeah, no, same. We haven't seen a program yet for it. It'll come later. Just that it is sort of the first SDG summit since 2015. Other than the HLPF, it really is the first UN summit since 2015 on the SDGs. But no, we haven't seen any programming yet either.
Great. So I guess keep your eyes open for more details on that coming up. In terms of the second part of this question, what is the biggest need to increase sustainability practices of companies in Canada? So I'm interpreting that as what can companies do to interact with the Sustainable Development Goals? Does anyone have some insight on that?
Well, I'll take a crack at it. I think there's a lot that they can do. I think I can speak from just personal experience, having done some of this engagement across Canada and talking to private sector and working with Global Compact Network Canada. I think it varies between small, medium, large businesses. Right now, there are varying levels of adoption of the SDGs. Some are starting to look at it, how they can sort of retool their corporate social responsibility plans to be more aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. Some are choosing particular goals that are relevant to their business and their business practice or supply chains. So there seems to be an appetite for learning more about it. There seems to be interest in using the Sustainable Development Goals framework as a means to start to not only develop their CSR, but to also start looking at their actual sort of business strategies. So from what I've seen is sort of a varying knowledge of the SDGs and a varying uptake, but there is certainly a willingness and an interest from the business community in Canada to look into the SDGs more seriously. And we've met with companies like Air Canada, TELUS, Hydro-Quebec, you know, all kinds and even small businesses. And they're all talking about the Sustainable Development Goals in different ways. And we just take that as a very positive signal and are encouraging them to continue to work with other stakeholders and to participate in multi-stakeholder events, and we're providing lots of information to the private sector. So yeah, that's just a sort of a personal view of what.
Great, thanks, Tina. That's actually very interesting. I know for myself, I didn't realize the government was doing all of that outreach to the private sector, so that's really great to hear. We've got a question here from Mike. Given that these reports are a lot of work, how best can they be utilized, especially in light of the current strategy and implementation? Curious to hear people's thoughts on how these reports can be best utilized. Anyone from the report team, how would you like to see the report utilized? All the work that you've done.
I mean, from my perspective, I think it would be good to know that people in the government, not only kind of in the SDG unit, but in the units beyond, or in the departments beyond that link to the different goal areas, are reading these. And so I think we do that outreach, but I think are they connected with the perspectives of civil society would be something that I would be interested in knowing. And then beyond that, I think it could be used to start a conversation about the role of civil society in carrying out the SDGs and holding governments accountable for the SDGs, and also the great work that we're doing in terms of just increasing, accelerating action on various areas of the SDG. So I think that's an important question from Mike in terms of, now we've done all this work, how do we move it forward? And I would be interested to hear if others have views on how we can best do that.
Yeah, if I can chime in as well, I think one of the big one great value of these reports that BCCIC has been doing for the past few years is that we sort of have established a best practice in methodology. Like, I think reaching out to as many experts from different areas of society, we've reached out to academics, people working for NGOs, people in the private sector. Like, we really have collected an in-depth diversity of opinions. I think this strategy is one that the SDG unit could potentially incorporate in future years. Like, I know we're not due for a VNR for a while, but just the process for the writing of the VNR last year was kind of not very transparent to civil society, in spite of the fact that civil society organizations had reached out to GAC at the time to be included in the process. And so I think yeah, in the future, this would be a great just sort of model for doing SDG research in Canada.
Yeah, and I'd like to follow up just to say that in terms of how we could best use it, I think we've shown ways that it could be. We're already doing that in some respect. First of all, I do think that initially Global Affairs Canada, now ESDC, they have been reading the reports. We always get great feedback from them. So I would like to at least give them credit for that and say thank you for considering civil society's input. And the way that we've been able to leverage the research that we've done is kind of apparent in the way that these reports have worked hand in hand with the policy briefs that Laurel has spearheaded along with CCIC. They're not separate. We've always considered them together. If we're developing a series of policy briefs that look at how can we structure an SDG unit in Canada, how do we do multi-stakeholder outreach, how do we develop the right set of targets and indicators, it's based on the research that we do with these experts in terms of the different SDGs. If we know, if we're listening to them and saying, okay, these are the recommendations of how to best measure progress in Canada, this is what we need to measure in order to make sure that we don't leave people behind, then that information can be incorporated into policy briefs, which we then share one-on-one with the government. So it's getting a direct line into how the formation of the SDG unit has happened so far, hopefully how the implementation strategy has developed. I think one further step that can be taken, and something that BCCIC has been advocating for from the beginning, and that kind of answers the transparency issue that Kayla brought up, is rather than just doing these one-off series of policy briefs, is to have an established body that works hand in hand with the government to advise on the SDGs. So we've always called it an advisory council, and it wouldn't just be civil society, but it would also be private sector. It would also be representatives from the Indigenous community. So every step along the way, there are stakeholders that can bring a diverse set of perspectives to implementation of the SDGs across Canada. So that's something that BCCIC has long called for. And then on the flip side of that, something that Sadie mentioned was, how can civil society organize itself? And so how might we use these reports in the very near future? Well, at HLPF, there's an opportunity for all Canadians who will be attending HLPF to come together beforehand, and BCCIC organized this in years past along with CCIC, of creating kind of a strategy body. Let's get together before HLPF. Let's figure out, all right, this is what's going on this year. This is what's under review. This is what our research shows. How can we best leverage this research at the HLPF when we have an opportunity to meet with our government one-on-one? Let's create some strategies as civil society to engage with our government, but to also do the work ourselves. It's not all on government. We have to do it ourselves. And so I think those are just a few ways that we can use this report in the very immediate future.
Hi, it's Tina. I just want to chime in too and say we absolutely will certainly here, I can speak on behalf of the SDG unit. We have read all of the policy briefs. We've read them several times. Just to talk a bit about the mechanics of what we do with them when they come into us. We have a few intergovernmental working groups. So we have a core intergovernmental working group with the 6 supporting departments that are supporting championing the SDG file in the federal government. So we have an ADM working group, a DG working group. We also have a policy and data working group and a communications and engagement working group. We use those working groups regularly to share information. We share all of the SDG funding projects that come in. We share all of the policy briefs that we received were shared with these groups. So we're doing, and it's a very engaged, I think when we set these groups up in the beginning, we were a little bit unsure of the sort of pickup and the engagement that we would get intergovernmentally. And they're actually really engaged and really active. And so we definitely share information through that route. I personally have pointed to reports when I'm doing engagement on the ground across Canada, depending on the type of information people are looking for, whether it's the concept of leave no one behind, or governance, or etc., whatever the topic may be. I often point to BCCIC, CCIC, or other council reports or IISD's reporting. So I also try to share that information as much as possible. And what was the last point I wanted to make? Escaping me, but I'll come back to it. I'll think of it in a second.
Great, thank you, Tina. It's very insightful to hear about that process and that sharing of information. Does anyone else have thoughts about how we can use these reports, this research, this information to further the Sustainable Development Goals?
Yeah, I can come in then, and not to repeat what you all have said in terms of the contributions of these reports. They not only reflect the real partnership that should happen in this Leave No One Behind process and achieving of SDGs, but they also are a huge resource of information and data, particularly in terms of the gaps that would be important for the government to address in the next phase, because it is through addressing of small priorities, whether those are at a smaller scale or a larger scale. This is how the SDGs can actually be addressed and move forward. And this is where BCCIC's and other civil society reports, which are non-partisan reports, and they reflect actually that middle ground of people's opinions and experts' opinions and academia contributions, those can be a really strong resource for the government to also measure themselves and to see through data that are collected through these reports, to see on how the progress is going and what should be done, what more can they do of, and what kind of new partnerships can they develop to address some of the gaps, and also to add to a particularly sensitive issue, which is data collection and SDG indicator and baseline setup, which has been a challenge throughout the world, but also for Canada. And I believe that this initiative that Tina mentioned in terms of the new grants that are coming for data and research, this is really important to really make sure that the capacities, the technical knowledge, and the methodology that civil society has come up with, for instance, the one that BCCIC has developed, is really utilized towards building that knowledge and capacity of the government to address SDGs in the future.
Great, thanks, Nora. So we've actually got a question from Deborah, from Deb on the team, to the experts who were interviewed for the report and who are potentially on this call right now. So if you are an expert listening in on this call, you can actually, I can give you privileges on the platform to speak, so I can turn your microphone on. So if you want to answer with a microphone, maybe just type in the chat box and I can do that. But the question is there anything critical that the SDG unit or the audience should walk away from this call with? So this is a question for the experts. And maybe while the experts are responding, I've got one more question that came in here. So I'll bring that back to the panel, and then I'll come back to this question to the experts. So if there's any experts on the call, please type in the chat box and I'll turn your microphone on. But we've got a question here. With the federal election coming up, how can civil society ensure that the 2030 agenda stays a priority and keep the momentum going, especially considering that Canada just released their 2030 agenda strategy a few months away from the election? So how can we keep the 2030 agenda a priority with the federal election coming up? This is a question for the panelists, for all of you. Anyone?
I mean, I'll try to answer, but I see that Alexandra Harrington's on the call and she's willing to talk, so I'd rather give space to her first.
Okay, sure, we can come back to that question. So you guys get a couple minutes to think about it. Alexandra, I'll turn your microphone on. So you should be able to turn that on and speak.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great, excellent. First of all, thank you so much. I was very lucky to be interviewed by Nora, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to contribute to this in some way to this report. I am lead counsel for Peace, Justice, and Governance with the Center for International Sustainable Development Law. I know it's a huge name, which is based in McGill in Montreal, but has worked with the SDG unit. We've actually had the chance to work with Tina, so it's lovely to get to hear more from you. But what I had wanted to point out in response to the question about what might be critical for the audience to walk away from, just in terms of the SDGs in Canada, and I had mentioned this to Nora, is that Canada doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. In terms of certainly the legal frameworks that exist. There are many legal frameworks within the provinces, within the modern treaties with the Indigenous communities, and at the federal level that really will allow a lot of implementation of the SDGs if they're found, if these provisions are actually acted on properly and reported on properly. So the real critical nature of that for me is to make everyone kind of aware of the fact that Canada has already done so much and already has this infrastructure available. So we don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel, which may also just get into the question of, in the election cycle, not having to reinvent the wheel as something that could be a political issue. So thank you.
And then if I can follow up on that really quickly, BCCIC had also about a year and a half ago had started doing a project with UBC students looking at existing either regulatory or legal frameworks and trying to find existing regulations or laws that could be leveraged to implement the SDGs in Canada. It started in BC, but it goes along with that. Yeah, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So it's really good to hear. And it kind of goes to what I wanted to say about the elections. Is it is important to note that there's a lot of SDG work going on around Canada and in the government that's not called SDG work. It exists outside of the UN lingo. So I think it's important during the election cycle, whether you're organizing around town hall meetings or attending election events, to recognize that there is work that's being done and the language just might not line up to SDG work. Bring that language forward if you have the opportunity, but just be aware of that. It's kind of not reinventing the wheel. It does exist, and it's important. It's incumbent on us as civil society to point out where those overlaps do occur and to point out also where they don't.
Great, thanks Alexandra and Deb. Any other thoughts from the speakers about federal election and the SDGs or any of the other topics that have come up in the last couple minutes? Don't be shy.
Hi, it's Tina. I remembered what I had forgotten I wanted to say earlier, but I did want to say that we are to the point of a stakeholder advisory committee, that we are planning to establish an external advisory committee next year in 2020 to help advise the SDG unit and the Government of Canada moving forward on implementing the 2030 agenda here in Canada. So we will be looking to establish that multi-stakeholder external advisory committee next year.
Great, thanks Tina. I've got one more question that came in about recommendation. It looks like maybe for the Peace and Justice SDG. He says, I'm really struggling with this recommendation and evidence to support. And then he talks about there's good evidence that over 100 years that prohibition and enforcement-centric efforts on substances, on gun and gangs, generate more harm than good to the public purse and in terms of socioeconomic costs, especially for those people living through inequity. And that support for provincial, territorial, and community-based initiatives to deal more effectively with gun and gangs, including tighter restrictions, heightened enforcement, and enhanced detection and prohibition of illicit substances across the border. So this seems to just be a question about, Nora, I think this was your section on gun and gangs, or was that SDG 10, inequalities? Could someone speak to that, the evidence, the recommendation and the evidence around prohibition and enforcement on substances, guns and gangs?
Yeah, that was my part actually. It was on SDG 16 indicators, and all of that was not a detailed research on specific issue. It is one of the issues that is in the rise, and it is something that the upstream interventions are noted by the experts as something that could support this initiative. So not only top down with the enforcement of laws and programs, but also connecting those to the bottom up approaches with the more municipal engagement, with civil society engagement, and with the community engagement, because as the evidence shows, these intervention types not only reduce the numbers of the violence that can come out of the higher substance abuse and the number of crimes, but it can also reduce the expenses for the government and the overall impact on population. So this is one of the recommendations that came through the discussion with the experts in terms of specific dealing with the issues of gangs and violence that follows that.
Great, thank you, Nora. So I think that's all of the questions, unless I've missed any. I don't think so, though. So would anyone like to say any last words about the reports or the briefs or anything coming up to look out for? Just wrapping up this webinar, since we're rounding in on an hour and a half. It's amazing how quickly the time goes when you're talking about something interesting. But any last words from anyone? Tina or Deb?
I guess kind of shifting gears, I wonder if there's anything, Tina, that you can say in terms of what the government's plan for engagement is over the next couple of weeks at HLPF, kind of using these resources, the policy briefs, the report, and the newly released implementation strategy. And then maybe there's an opportunity after this call, maybe it's through Diane or Laurel, to figure out who's going to HLPF from Canadian civil society to kind of get those strategy planning meetings going and figuring out how we can work with the government while there.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for that. And I was going to do one final plea for feedback on the towards Canada's 2030 Agenda National Strategy. It is available online at canada2030agenda.ca, and we, there's mechanisms to gather feedback online, also through our social media at Canada 2030 Agenda, and certainly by email anytime to myself or the 2030 Agenda email address, which I can share around, which you guys all have. But yeah, we will be engaging and having conversations over the summer. It is a bit of a a bit of an interesting time for us with the election. So we're going to be relying a lot too on our civil society partners and others to help shepherd this document through over the course of the summer. So we certainly would welcome your help and assistance in helping to promote it through your network so that we can continue to gather feedback and refine it before we launch a first national strategy. Yes, we will be at the high-level political forum. I understand we're hosting the BCCIC side event at our permanent mission in New York, and participating in that. We'll also be hosting a meet and greet with Canadians, stakeholders on the ground, and I think more details of that are to come later this week. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Tina. Well, maybe with that, we'll wrap up this webinar. Thank you very, very much to all of the presenters. Thank you very much to the audience for sticking around, especially for an hour and a half. We hope that you enjoyed it and that you take a look at the report, not just this one, but ones from previous years, as well as the Agenda 2030 strategy, and feed in if you have some information and knowledge that can be helpful to progressing the SDGs in Canada. So thank you very much to everyone, and hope to see you in the coming weeks and months as we all work together on the Sustainable Development Goals. So thank you.
Thanks very much.